Because of COVID-19, companies of all sizes and industries are accelerating their digital transformation programs, and many are moving their data to the cloud without having all the security controls in place that are necessary to protect not only their data, but their customers' data as well. And they're doing that because they want to move very quickly. And if they focus on security, it could slow down their digital transformation process. But this can leave them vulnerable to cyber attacks and just being out of compliance in general with data protection regulations and all sorts of regulations out there. I'm Carol Vercellino. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Oak City Labs. We're a software development agency located in the Raleigh-Durham area. And with me here today is Josh Wyatt, the Chief Information Security Officer with InfiniaML. And InfiniaML, you have a great team working on some pretty exciting stuff in the machine learning space. So to get started, Josh, would you be willing to just give us a quick 30-second introduction to Infinia and what you do there?
Sure. So InfiniaML, we are what I would call a technology-enabled services company. We do a lot of high-level client projects focused around machine learning, some other aspects of artificial intelligence, usually to solve some kind of business problem that they've had trouble solving in conventional ways. We also have a product suite that includes a library and some other tooling that we use in conjunction of delivery of these services. And we have pretty healthy client base. We have an outstanding team. We have what I would estimate probably the top 0.5% of machine learning talent in the country, if not the world. And just a great team. Not a huge company, but definitely the best in our space, I feel. So,
yeah,
thank you.
You all definitely have a great reputation, and we go way back. We've worked together or have known each other for quite a while. And as far as security individuals go, you and maybe one other person in the area are the people that I would think to go to when it comes to security. And I think one of the things that sets you apart is not only do you know the security space very well, but you're also very hands-on, and your ability to kind of keep in touch with things hands-on and understand everything underneath it is incredible. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump into some questions. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So just to kind of get started, what do you think in terms of data and security matters now more than ever?
So I think going back historically, there was a huge focus on centralized security. When you have people all in a central location, it's a lot easier to monitor activity, like on the network, et cetera. With server-centric infrastructure, very similar. These days, and this isn't necessarily, wasn't started by the COVID-19 situation, but it certainly made it more interesting. Things are more decentralized, right? So there's Google's initiatives that strongly espouse endpoint security and that sort of thing. I think that's where things are headed. COVID-19 brought it even more to the forefront, and where employee bases are now, 100% remote for a lot of technology organizations. Monitoring activity in such a distributed scenario is pretty challenging. And the tool set, there are tool sets out there, but the space is not what I would call quite mature. I'm sure some vendors would disagree with that, with their offerings, but it's more challenging than ever on that front. And obviously cloud made that more challenging with people embracing Amazon Web Services and infrastructure in the cloud and a kind of distributed environment. So, yeah.
And for those who maybe aren't in the security space, when you say endpoint security, what's kind of the definition of that?
A great example is probably like data loss prevention tooling. In the old days, that was pretty easy to do. You'd set some kind of sensor on a centralized point in your network, a choke point, and watch for behavioral patterns like large outbound data transfers or things of that nature. And that's much more challenging with a distributed workforce where people are working from home or they're working from other places, and there's no single choke point. So the choke point actually moves out to the edge of the network where people are doing their work. and in a distributed fashion versus more centralized.
Interesting. Okay. And maybe do you have like a recommendation or two for people? Would it be like a vendor that they talk to, like software tools, or would you manage that via like policies and procedures and training for your staff?
Yep. So great question. I think 100% start with culture and training. Let your organization know that this is something that you value, is important. The tools are almost, it doesn't matter, right? Because, you're going to, you could evaluate and choose a tool and then 6 months later choose a different one based on, who's the front runner in the space. I'm a little loath to recommend specific tools just due
Right.
to the variability in the market right now. But it can be a big challenge.
Do you think that's an opportunity in the market space for for software or a company?
I do. The trend I see is that larger entities that are big in the network space, like Cisco or others, they have solutions, but they generally tend to be kind of heavy-handed. And for someone like us, right, with 35 employees, we're probably not going to deploy some massive heavy-handed solution to, basically spy on our employee base. We want to have an environment where we trust people to do their work and make sure they are aware of the consequences of any kind of failure on that front. Recognizing that sometimes it may not be directly their fault, right? It may be malware that gets inadvertently installed on their machine, like by a drive-by. Like I've seen malware drops happen even from compromised banner ad servers. So you're just
Oh,
on
yeah.
a website, like a news website or whatever, banner ad comes up, infects your machine, now you have malware, right? So versus other like, willful ignorance or, hey, I just need to make this real convenient real quick or whatever, which does happen too. And that gets onto incident response, right? It's the thought of, it's not a matter of if it will happen, but when and what is your plan. So planning goes back to it, kind of your initial intro you were talking about. Right now, folks are racing to move data or infrastructure out to the cloud to accommodate these, remote working scenarios or convenience. That doesn't ad hoc happen. I mean, it happens quickly, but it's usually part of a plan, and that plan needs to include, some kind of management around risk.
So, in part of that planning process, what do you think some of the top security threats would be moving to the cloud if they haven't already if they don't already have their data in the cloud?
I think probably the biggest one is just you have to be an informed consumer of any kind of service or product, and before you give anyone money or your crown jewels, the data for your business or things like that, you need to understand what the risk is and what you're consuming. Every service offers some level of control, right? And so there's just diligence you need to do, right? I think it's like anything else you buy, a car or any kind of service, insurance, anything like that, you need to understand the value proposition tied to that and what the risks are, and have a plan for managing that risk as you make that move. There
So
are
if you were,
lots, right? I mean, the objective with Amazon Web Services, for example, is to remove barriers to entry, get your stuff going as fast as you can. You just have to understand what the controls are, be ready to implement them, make that part of your planning consideration.
So if you were working with a company that was moving from maybe on-premise or hosting their data in a internally managed data center and they're moving it to AWS, is there anything specific that you would look for in an AWS infrastructure specifically to manage risk?
There are a bunch of things. One is, as always, understand the architecture of what you're moving, right? It's never just a lift and shift from on-premises to cloud in the first place. It frequently requires re-architecture of your application. When you look at that, you have to look at considerations of things like least privilege. Remember, you're in a shared environment, instead of like a dedicated environment, and that comes with some risk. Always review the compliance attestations for wherever you're moving to. Amazon's are pretty good, and they have to be, right? So that's just an example. There are other vendors. If you go to more SaaS vendors that run their infrastructure in the cloud, and ideally, anyone who's making this understands their compliance landscape too, right? Like health organizations, CROs, whatever, they're going to know about HIPAA, high tech, high trust. Anyone that's into e-commerce understands implications with PCI, things of that nature too. So you're going to do some diligence. Anything specific to Amazon, though, I would recommend making sure that part of your threat, you have to have a threat assessment program and that kind of thing that involves audits, testing, and that's a knob you can turn, right? So you can either do you can hire a consultant who can give you best practices, and then you implement them and you put those best practices in your backlog, prioritize them, implement them, all the way up to hiring, penetration tester externally to come in every quarter to, give you a full report of your exposure and that sort of thing, which can also feed a backlog and that type of thing.
What should a company, and I recognize companies of all different sizes, the answer to this question is going to be kind of tough, but what should companies set aside a budget for security, for penetration testing, for bringing in a security consultant? And if so, and they're a small company, maybe even a startup, do you have a recommendation in terms of size of budget, or do you think that just varies too much?
I think you need to understand your industry and your business landscape and that type of thing, and what your competition looks like. That's always the case too with budgets too, right? Like, are they spending more on this than I am? Are they spending less on this than I am? And like for us, for example, the nature of our business is data. That's our bread and butter for sure. And we deal with a lot of data, and our customers are very sensitive about it. You won't see very many 35-person companies with a CISO, but we have one. And, I think you may also position it as, a competitive advantage, right? If you're willing to achieve, say, a SOC 2 attestation before it's really required for you, you might be able to tout that from a marketing point of view, things like that. So there should be some kind of budget. A lot of startups don't operate with super firm budgets, but it comes down to the value system of the leadership. Like, what do they value? What is important? That is frequently driven by the customer base. For a startup, that is probably a very varied, like wildly varied population. And some may have no requirements, and some may have more stringent requirements. For a larger organization, you probably have many clients who demand certain things from you, and because your clients are going to be bigger, and they will drive heavily what your trajectory looks like from a security point of view.
So what do you think common mistakes are that companies make when they're shifting from like on-premise, or their whole team's going remote and everything's in the cloud all of a sudden?
I think that probably the most common mistake is of treating everything as one side of the business will treat something, technology or their product, as a proof of concept. And there are, a long list of things that they mean to do one day, right? That should be on the list. And then the other side of the company is already selling that product. It's already out in there, going in the wild. They're accomplishing the marketization of it and the proliferation of it out in the space. And, you end up with an alpha or beta level thing that's production. And that can be a good thing, and that can be a bad thing. I mean, it's like any other set of risks that you have to manage. I think the key piece is you want everybody on the same page with regards to that thing. And it's not as if you're going to get everybody in the business in the room all at once to agree that, hey, this thing we're building is going to be in production. And everybody's cool with that because there will be no defects in it, security or otherwise. right? So
Yeah.
it's more important to have a plan to manage whatever those eventualities are, right? The last thing you want is a surprise on day 10 after a release, and it's a huge security breach that released all your data or all your clients' data, and someone knew about that defect, but it was not managed, right? You don't want that kind of surprise. And
Okay.
that's shockingly common. The other thing that is very surprising is actually non-technical, and that's in the realm of social engineering. That's pretty common, especially for targeted attacks, because it's generally 100% successful. Twitter just went through a scenario where some of their internal employees were compromised and gave up some keys to the kingdom by virtue of access to a Slack channel that employees used. And even through technological solutions like multi-factor authentication, et cetera, some bad guys got in there, got some keys to the kingdom and abused it. So it goes back to training, right?
Yeah. So do you think social engineering approaches are the most effective and the most used?
Humans have been using them for hundreds of years, right? So they
Yeah.
are very effective.
Okay.
I don't know if they're necessarily the most used because so many other things are easy to automate, right? Like malware distribution or whatever. But even like spam email, right?
Yeah.
That's the blurry line between automation and social engineering, right? And people wouldn't do it if it didn't work, right?
That's true. Very true. So when should someone bring in a security consultant, and what should they look for in someone to help them with security?
So I think, so this is, to me, this is a question of generalization versus specialization. I think any kind of immediate, like even at the concept stage, someone needs to have a mindset around security, right? It may not be a dedicated individual. It won't be a dedicated individual, but it has to be a consideration. I think at the point where you perceive the risk is too high for you to manage with the expertise you have on hand, either in your own head or in your team or whatever, I think that's where you start having a discussion internally, with your leadership team, et cetera, about, hey, we have this risk now that maybe we didn't have before for whatever reason. What's our strategy for managing this risk? There's no set time. I can't tell you like after the first year or whatever. I mean, if you were starting a new antivirus company, you might not hire anybody but security engineers at the beginning. If you are, doing online publishing, might be different,
What about if you're a medical device startup?
So if you're a medical device startup, probably not my strongest wheelhouse. I would think you're going to go back to basics. You're going to look at trust relationships between points in your infrastructure and evaluate risk from that perspective. You'd look at the competitive landscape. Ideally, you're not going into the whole industry blind, right? You'll have some experience and background and understand what the landscape looks like, and understand opportunities to align yourself with what's going on in the industry, but also opportunities to differentiate yourself, especially if the cost is low. For example, encryption. Encryption is a no-brainer. You should always use encryption. People still don't because they think it's too hard or too much work. It is roughly about the same amount of work to implement encryption than to not, usually, generally. And for a medical device, that's a huge dynamic range, right? Could it, it might be a pacemaker, it might be something that's never connected to the internet, like a digital thermometer, forehead thermometer, something like that. And Fitbit, which I don't necessarily consider a medical device, but that data is being used by a lot of medical organizations. Some are deals. So, you look at your threat space and all of that. I would think that once you start implementing trust relationships between infrastructure points like a medical device and the cloud or the internet, you're going to be thinking We need to fortify that. We need to defend it. We need to look at other risks with it, like making it scalable, making sure, just being very defensive about the data associated with it and that type of thing. So I would think pretty early on for something of that kind of architecture.
So pretty early. Is there anything that you would look for in a consultant? How do you basically, a lot of times people, they kind of know they need to hire a security consultant, but they're not really sure what to look for. And how do you make sure somebody's like legit and can actually help you execute on creating that security plan and kind of doing a risk assessment and then helping a company understand, okay, once we do an assessment and have a plan in place, here's what I need to do moving forward. I think there's a lot of people that, talk about security, but may not help much with the execution of it.
Yeah, probably especially too if that's not your bailiwick, right? So if you're let's say you're a doctor that has moved into the space and you have some technical knowledge, you've seen a huge gap in the industry, and you have some people in your neighborhood that you met or whatever, and they seem to be very strong with technology or maybe IoT design, engineering. You're fairly knowledgeable, but how do you evaluate, right? Like a security professional.
Yeah.
I think, so that could be tough. I think you can start small, right? Like any other like progressive project management methodology, start with small scope, look at deliverability, those types of things. There are tons of people that will give you their opinions. And some of it's good, some of it's bad,
Yeah.
I think too, though, if you focus on some of the basics, right, about defending the data, those sorts of things, you'll probably, through sniffing around in the industry, get some referrals. Referrals are always good. Those sorts of things. That's really hard.
Yeah.
And I think though, at the end of the day, the technological challenges aren't necessarily barn burners. They're not, the bigger challenges may be around privacy or legal or things like that. By the way, I do think legal organizations can be a pretty good source of that. Patent attorneys frequently have some good connections on that front. So it's good to have a good network that maybe you can suss out a recommendation or a referral.
Okay. All right. Well, before we end, maybe two quick questions. Do you have one or two resources, whether it's like a website or a book or somebody to follow if people want to learn more about security and data protection?
So I think, so there are a few resources. A very important one is just to stay aware of what's going on, like on the threat landscape. The US CERT organization, it's a government-sponsored organization, us-cert.gov is an excellent resource for just staying up to date with what the threat landscape looks like, et cetera. And another great resource for me has been, I don't know him, so fairly impartial plug here, except the content is excellent. Krebs on Security, Brian Krebs' blog is very, very good. He's sort of a cross between like a security technologist. I wouldn't call him like a security engineer per se, although he has pretty good background, but also kind of an investigative journalist kind of mindset. His writing style is very accessible, frequent updates, a great resource to follow. The other thing is increasingly, especially if you're in a sensitive space, most law enforcement type organizations will have some resources or those sorts of things. That's more local.
Okay.
But they will have some resources, and it's better to establish that kind of relationship early and often so that, in the future, if and when you might have an incident or a breach or something like that, you have an established path or relationship.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's something people don't think of. So thank you for those resources. And then finally, what's one step a company or a person could take right now to move forward in putting the proper protections or security controls in place?
To put in controls, I think the very first thing is to do an assessment.
Okay.
You could either do it yourself, you could hire an external entity to do the assessment for you. Assessment is a very broad term. It could be anything from, you know, ask someone their opinion of your environment or infrastructure configuration, all the way up to organized penetration test or red teaming. But do some sort of assessment so that, you know, you understand, you know, when you walk into this dark room, at least have a flashlight, shine it around a little bit. What are the things I can stump my toe on? What are the things I might fall on that hurt me? Is there someone hiding in the corner, right?
Yep.
So a lot of different kind of flashlights, a lot of different ways to do that kind of exploratory thing. You probably already have an idea in some ways, things you're concerned about or not too concerned about. That's a great place to start. And the assessment will give you something also that's actionable, right? It will give you more information than you had before, and something you can walk away and plan some work around too. So that's the first step I would think.
Okay, great. So first step, an assessment of what you have currently. So kind of what my takeaways from this are, is there's such a huge human element to security. I think oftentimes most of us jump straight to the technology. What software can I use to control things? And we forget about the leadership and the training process for people, just the humans in our companies, to better understand data security and why it's important. And then also the planning process. People and planning are two of the largest things in security, and it maybe doesn't have to be as complex as we make it out to be. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
That is pretty accurate. And, you know, it comes down to leadership too. You have to value it. It has to be something that is valued by your leadership team, and those sorts of things. People are always going to be a weak point, right? There's a comic out there, and maybe you can dig it up for the to insert in the interview later, but it's a boxing ring, and in one corner it's got the announcer who says, in this corner we have firewalls, we have IDS, we have training, we have blah 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 blah, and in the other corner we have Dave, right? Dave, the employee who just wants to get his work done, doesn't pay a lot of attention to things.
Password is password one.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that's a pretty good one.
Okay.
A lot of training. Training is important. Keeps it in people's minds. And I don't mean the generic pre-recorded click through this while you're doing your other work kind of training. It has to be immersive, engaging, interactive, ideally synchronous, so that the people there are face-to-face with you. I do all of the training here face-to-face, and it's fairly differentiated based on the scenarios that are important, and it evolves too, right? So it's pretty important, but people for sure. People are a big piece of the pie here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Josh. And I will say one of the things about you and Jared Sexton, who's another great security professional, is you both were always very approachable. So when we work together, I think that's also important, is when you're working with a security person, whether it's an engineer, a consultant, or someone, you know, on your team, or a third party, is they should also be very approachable. And I think sometimes security gets a bad rap in organizations for being people that you don't want to approach and you're going to get in trouble with. And you've been a phenomenal resource in that front. And I know InfiniaML is well served by having you on their team. So thank you again, Josh, for sharing your insights and also your time on data security. And we hope everyone who is listening found this discussion valuable. And if you have any more questions or comments for us about data security, please make sure to leave them in the comments below. And if you enjoyed our Q&A today and want to get more tech tips and resources, please like or follow Oak City Labs on our social media pages, or you can also head over to our website at oakcity.io to learn more about our software development services. So thank you so much, Josh, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Carol. Have a great day.
You too.
Yep. Bye-bye.